So we've been doing a series of sessions wherein we've been interviewing techies, and we have already interviewed close to like 5 techies earlier around backend development, data science, and DevOps, and other bunch of roles, right? And today we have with us Vaneet Singla, who plays a role as a product manager. He comes with more than 15 years of experience in the industry, and he's worked with large companies like Make My Trip, Practo, and recently he joined Jubilant FoodWorks, and he works there as a chief product officer. And if you are a foodie, I think you should be knowing Jubilant FoodWorks, right? Because it's a mothership company which run a lot of companies like Domino's and Chef Boss and lot many others. If you are a foodie, you must be knowing Jubilant, right? And he plays the role of a chief product officer. I think Vaneet joined there recently, a month or 2 months back, right? And also Vaneet does a lot of consulting. He does advisory for a lot of startups. And even I reached out to him sometime recently, asking him some inputs around building the recruiting Monk community. How do we go about? So it's a pleasure to have someone like Vaneet to understand more about the product manager role, and I believe that will help a lot of recruiters who have tuned in here, and also those who will tune in later to understand this particular role. So thanks, Vaneet, for tuning in. I welcome you for this particular discussion.
Sure. So pleasure, dude. So happy to have a conversation on this, and happy to help in any way.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So Vaneet, taking this conversation with one of the very basic questions, right? What I want to understand is this product manager role is like buzzing for a bunch of years, right? But if you see the way the tech has evolved over a period of time, this particular role wasn't there. If you see maybe 12 years back, 15 years back, the internet world is there for quite some time, but there was no role like product manager, right? And people who did recruitment, I think maybe 10, 12 years back, all they knew was project manager. They've never heard of this term called as product manager, right? So we had developers, and even in development, we had just web developer back then. There was nothing like front end, back end, right? So can you help us understand how did this role product manager evolve, right? So why there's a huge demand for product? Let's start with why did it evolve, right? What is the purpose from a tech context, and how did it evolve as a role?
Got it. In fact, so I have a slight difference of opinion, right? So product manager as a role didn't exist by that name, but it always existed by the role, right? So go back to 1930s, and I would say that so the original FMCGs, and that was essentially a golden period for the FMCGs, right? So all the products that we end up using day in day out. So the origin for those products happened back in 1930s, 1940s. And there was someone designing these products, someone understanding the consumer behavior, consumer needs, and then designing products around them. Just that we knew those PMs, product managers of those days, by different names. So we used to call them brand managers. Some people used to call them as something else. In fact, like I was talking to a friend in an FMCG world of late, right? And some FMCG still call their brand managers as product managers, because the job is exactly that, which is understanding the consumer, understanding what they want, understanding their needs, and then creating a product or solution around those, right? But to talk about more recent times, right? So you're absolutely spot on that the PM that we know of today didn't exist even like 10 years back, right? So especially in India, right? In Indian context, I think Make My Trip was one of the early movers on product bandwagon, but even there, so they won't hire PMs prior to 2009. Prior to 2009, it used to be like yet another business guy, right? So I would say that the evolution in India has happened in 3 different phases. Phase number 1 happened in 2000, so where you had, or in fact, like even prior to that, about around 95, where you had all these IT companies hiring a bunch of project managers, where the role used to be delivery of the project, right? So you had the specs being done elsewhere. You're not worried about the impact or the potential play or potential leverage you will create for the organization. All you're worried about is, hey, these are the specs, and how do I ensure that these specs get delivered in the defined timelines? True. So project delivery used to be the first phase. Phase 2 happened around 2000, 2003, 2004, where so some company like Microsoft opened up their dev centers in India. Companies like I would say dare I say that even Yahoo opened up their dev center in India, and these guys used to operate in waterfall model, right? So yes, you are responsible for impact delivery. You are responsible for defining the product specs and not only for delivering the product specs that were defined elsewhere. And then the third phase started happening around 2010, and it's obviously right now it's at its peak, right? Where you're not only responsible for delivery, but most importantly, you're responsible for impact delivery. You're measured on impact. You're not measured on, I would say, feature delivery, right? And the other change that happened was that we moved away from waterfall. We moved into agile, which means that so essentially. When Yahoo's and Microsoft of the world were getting to the product world, and even today for that matter, right? So you had these 6 monthly to 1 year cycles, right? So whatever you're thinking about today, so you get to see that in the real world probably a year down the line. That has changed today, right? So whatever you're thinking about, so the world is agile today. So whatever you're thinking about, so you ideally should be seeing that live in the market, experimenting with that in maybe like a month. And if you're particularly agile, maybe in 15 days. So essentially, I think so that has been the evolution. So product managers not being known as product managers, but still doing the same job, still understanding the customer, delivering for the customer back in 1930s, then moving to the software world around 90s in US, in 2000s in India, and then moving to the agile fashion that you see today, right? So I think that has been the 3-step evolution in my view.
Okay. So what you're trying to say is, like, if I've understood it correctly, so from the time the product thing caught pace in India, right? I think before product, it was the Infosys and the TCS of the world, right? Which is more, we were more in the service side of things. So that's where I think we were more familiar with project manager. And once the product thing started catching up, as you mentioned, Yahoo started having their delivery centers here, right? And then the 2010, where the Flipkart era started, right around 2010, right? So then I think that's where product managers started catching up, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, maybe that was the pivotal point, right? So prior to that, all you used to have was, see again, so the point I'm making is that somebody was playing that impact delivery role always. Like, so even with Infosys, so because somebody was figuring out what to do. It's just that that person never sat inside Infosys. So that person probably sat inside the client location, or probably it was the client themselves, right? Even at Make My Trip, right? So Make My Trip started hiring PMs around 2008, right? So prior to that, so somebody was there in the Make My Trip who was actually deciding what needs to be done. And then it used to get passed over to that project manager to actually deliver on that. So that need for that role has always existed. So it is just that it has gotten formalized post 2010. And that's why you don't see many people who have done product management prior to 2010, because this role didn't exist in Indian ecosystem. But it was not that somebody essentially like that we were playing blind. Somebody was taking those calls. But formalization happened much later. Yeah, so you can call this as Flipkart effect. You can call this as the industry effect. And 2010 was the pivotal moment where role got a lot more formalized than it was prior to that. So I think that's a fair thing to say.
Okay, cool. So now, let's say if we have to draw some kind of comparison, right, in terms of project manager versus product manager, right, keeping today's way of how things are working in the tech world, right? So we have some set of folks project manager, we have some set of folks who are product manager. What are the key differentiating factor between these two folks?
Good question. I would say I'll give you a one-liner answer, and I'll give you like a slightly detailed answer, right? One-liner answer is a product guy, and I alluded to that during the first question. A product guy is responsible for impact delivery. So, and especially like I have been hiring manager, right? So I don't care about how many features you have delivered. I don't care about what has been the velocity of your team. I don't care about how hard you work. All I care about is what were the needle movers that you launched, how much impact you actually delivered. A project manager, one-line answer, is responsible for project delivery. So they don't care about impact at all. They probably care about timelines first and foremost, right? So impact delivery versus project timeline delivery. So that's the broad headline difference. If I have to double click on that, right? A product person is responsible for 4 things. A product person is responsible for first understanding the context, in my view, right? So probably in the organization, they have to be the person who has the maximum context on the customer. Second, they are responsible for figuring out what are the problems, what are the potential solutions. So number two, again, so they have to be the go-to person inside the organization for that point number two. Third, and probably the most important piece, is they're responsible for prioritization of those solutions, right? It's very easy to come up with a laundry list of what you want to do. The hard thing that needs to be done is figuring out what to go after, because your bandwidth is always going to be chopped. And the fourth is essentially the delivery of those solutions. So in a way, if you really think about it, right, and probably crudely, a product guy, product management is in a way a superset of project management. Project management is only about delivery. Product management is about a lot more things, because ultimately you are worried about impact than you're worried about timelines. Timelines don't matter in the product world, right? What really, of course they matter, but they don't matter as much in the product world, right? What matters a lot more is impact that it will create, which means that the ability to pick and choose the right problem and ability to pick and choose the right solution to that problem is much more important. So that would be the key difference. Are you moving the needle, or are you just delivering? That's the difference.
Awesome. So I think this particular takeaway is an amazing takeaway for most of the recruiters who are listening here, right? So what Vaneet was mentioning here is the impact, right, and the delivery timeline. So that's a major difference between your product managers versus your project manager, right? So if someone is a product manager, what you need to understand is the impact. What kind of impact this person was able to create, and the project manager is more about timelines, right? So that's the major differentiation. I think this would go a long way if recruiters look at this particular context and have conversations. Okay, now let's move to the next level of the conversation. The next level is, can you help us understand the difference between tech product managers versus the non-tech product manager? Because this is, I think, a gray area for a lot of the recruiters out there, right? Because this is something which most of them really not able to get this, because I believe this is a little ambiguous in terms of differentiating tech versus non-tech product managers.
Sure. I think the fundamentals stay same, right? So you're still responsible for impact delivery. But what changes? In fact, like the structural change is that your audience is different. So if you really think about the tech product managers, right? So the audience is either typically internal teams, internal developers, or external developers, right? So which means that the products, because that's the audience. So essentially the products that you're working on, you're either typically working platform products, which means that you need to have handle on technology. You need to not, for example, like most of the PMs, so they need to be able to have a technology conversation with their developers. But in case of tech PMs, unless you understand technology really deeply, you'll not be able to figure out what solutions to prioritize, or in fact, even like what solutions are possible. So it's no longer enough for you to have a shallow conversation on technology with your developers. You have to understand technology in a really, really deep fashion. And the reason for that is because your users are different. Your users are typically techie users. They are typically developers. You're developing platform for them to use. The users are not really, I would say, end users who don't care about technology. So these are the users who do care about technology. So for you to be effective, so you need to understand technology a lot more than I would say that a typical non-tech user would need to understand, right? So in terms of a real world difference, right? So I would say that a tech PM, a typically good tech PM would understand two things very well. They'll understand architecture very, very well. So if you give them an independent job to design an architecture of, I would say, a fairly complex system, so they should be able to hold their own. Not to say that it's obviously helpful in non-tech scenarios as well, but absolutely, I would say, really required in a tech context. So you'll not be a good tech PM unless you're able to architect the pieces of your platform by yourself, right, without help from external world. The other things obviously help. So if you understand your technology deeply, right, so especially if it's a deep tech play, right, so you're developing something on the voice or something, you're developing something on, let's say, these days, what's obviously like given is AI and ML, right? So unless you understand how those technologies work and unless you have some exposure to that, you'll not be able to figure out what are the potential solutions that you can bring out. So those are the pieces. I would say that some programming exposure or some past exposure where you actually developed as a developer that is helpful as a tech PM. So broadly, I think the key differences between tech and non-tech, the structural difference is the audience is different. So you're not developing for the end user. So here the user actually cares about technology. So, and it's deep tech. So unless you understand the technology in depth, so you'll not be able to figure out what are the potential solutions. The key determiners are the question number one: can you design an architecture independently? If you are able to do that, you typically would do a good job of being a tech PM. If there's a programming exposure that you have, so you probably developed something in past, so you'll probably again do a good job. So I think that's the key difference in my view.
Okay, let's say, okay, now I think you would have obviously worked with a lot of PMs and you would have hired a lot of PMs, right? Now, if you look at from a hiring standpoint, right? If I have to bring the hiring standpoint here, and we understand most and companies which are in the mid-size, right? Not the highly grown companies. I'm looking at startups and the mid-size companies. They prefer this cocktail, right? They prefer this perfect mocktail or a cocktail, wherein they want that architecture and also that go-to-market, the impact, what you were talking about, the perfect mix. Now that perfect mix is hardly there. We don't have those many people who have done that perfect mix, right? So now in that case, how do we go about, let's say you are a hiring manager, right? Because obviously you've played the role of a CPO, you would have seen these kind of scenarios and you would understand key there are not many people who come with this balance, right? So in that case, as a hiring manager, right, what do you think the right approach needs to be?
See, a perfect PM and you're spot on is a unicorn, right? So I haven't seen a single person in the last 15 years who ticks like all the 10 skill boxes. So we have like a skill mapping of 10 different skills, right? And not a single person in the last 15 years who was strong on all 10. So that doesn't exist. That unicorn doesn't exist, right? I'll tell you my approach, right? So my approach almost always is I start by answering the question in my mind that why am I hiring this person for? What impact do I want to create, right? So once I'm clear about that question in terms of the impact that I want to create, like the problem I'm trying to solve for myself, the second question is what are the must-have skills that I'm not going to compromise on, and what are good to have, and what are the skills that I don't care. So those 10 skills, get mapped in these three clusters. Then typically I optimize for must-have skills. Two skills that are common across all the functions, regardless of whether it's a tech PM, non-tech PM, user-focused PM, data PM. So the first is the ability to work in a team, which is because like one of the first and foremost predictors for your success is your ability to work with the larger dev team, ability to rally a team. And second is product sense, which is ability to, or sometimes you call it problem solving, sometimes you call this product sense. But essentially what that means is ability to understand the problem, ability to think about the solutions, good solutions, and then ability to prioritize those solutions. So these two are must have for every single PM. And then depending on the need, so for example, if I'm hiring a tech PM, so I would want someone who has the tech chops. So who understands architecture, who understands programming. If I'm hiring a user-focused PM, I would go for UX jobs. So again, so different ways to test for those. If I'm hiring for data PM, right? So somebody who has to work in the data platform, I would want that person to probably be aware about data science models and probably must have done something on data science in past. If I'm hiring for a backend PM, for example, so I would want someone who is probably pretty aware about one platform. Second, again, I would say should be aware about latencies and everything, right? So idea is that you have these 10 skills. You are able to pick and so you're not going to get somebody who's perfectly fine at all 10. So you pick and choose what are the most important pieces for you, and then you optimize your hiring for that. In fact, the best recruiting managers that I've worked with, so they spend a lot of time in understanding the problem that I'm trying to solve for by hiring for this role. They spend a lot of time understanding the skill set I'm looking for, and then spend a lot of time pre-filtering candidates basis those skill sets. So short and sweet answer is 2 to 3 skill sets that are must have, and then optimize entirety of hiring around that. We test for all 10 anyway, just to get a complete picture of the candidate, but the rest are good to have.
Okay. So I've understood from if I've understood right correctly from what you've mentioned, like there are 10, let's say there are 10 skills which is required for a PM. You don't get unicorns. There are not many unicorns out there. There might be, right? So to fit in, as you mentioned, based on what you're trying to achieve, right? Let's say you want someone very strong with go-to-market and the impact of whatever feature is being built, and a little bit on the tech know-how, so he can engage with the tech team and at least get that going. Maybe you have someone else who can look at the deeper aspects of architecture and the latency and stuff, right? Then you would actually have a heat map types, right? Key, okay, this particular area is where I need to focus a lot more because that's my current concern, right? And the other area maybe is taken care by an architect, right? He is involved in terms of the architectural decisions, in terms of the latency and everything, right? So now beyond JD, don't you think we need a little more beyond the JD? Maybe like a persona map, right? So if I can create a little more detailed persona maps, I'll get more details, right? So now as a hiring manager, what do you advise to your maybe recruiters or the kind of people you work with, or maybe in general, if someone wants to work with as a recruiter, what would you advise? Because JDs are generic, they are just text at the end of the day. So how do you go beyond? One is maybe I can have a conversation with you, try to understand what you need, but again, I might miss out on some points, right? Because after 1 month, if you ask me some pointers from this discussion, maybe I'm not able to recollect because of the human errors and gaps which we have, right? We will not be able to recollect information. So now, can we have some kind of a structure wherein I'm able to get the blueprint of what exactly you want, right? So what would you suggest in that case?
Sure. Good question. So I would suggest, like, in fact, like, I don't think that there's any shortcut to this, right? So you have to spend time with the hiring manager, and please force your hiring managers to answer this question: that what problem are they even trying to solve by hiring for this person, by hiring this PM? So unless you get this answer, so you'll not be able to move forward. You'll not be able to do a good job because you're flying blind. So once you get that answer, at least like initial context, and might be a subjective context, the second question you should try and get an answer to are like, what are the key skill sets that are required for this person to be successful in this job? Please get an answer to that. Even if you're not able to get an answer to the first, please absolutely 100% get an answer to second. So, and I think that should be pretty easy, right? Because, for example, again, to build upon the previous point, so if I'm hiring for the user-facing role, if I'm hiring for the front-end PM, so I'll not hire anyone who's not good at UX, who probably cannot do probably a 50% job of a UX guy, right? So I'll not hire anyone. If I'm hiring as a tech PM, I'll not hire anyone who's not good at architecture. So we are not expecting a complete full-blown architecture from them, but they should be able to hold their own in that architecture discussion. If I'm hiring for the data PM, I'll not hire anyone who's not probably like 50% data scientist. So please get a sense of must-have skill sets. So every hiring manager is different. So they would have a different list of these must-have skill sets. Step number one, this is absolutely super important. Step number two, the best of the hiring recruiting partners I've worked with spend a lot of time on pre-filtering candidates. They're having this conversation with the candidates, right? So I'm sure you talk to like 10 people, right? So go beyond. So don't only understand what they have been up to. So understand these skill sets, 3 or 4 or 5 skill sets, and then understand how these people have delivered upon those skill sets in either in their past experience. If you're hiring for freshers, what's their perspective on those skill sets? They might have done some projects where they might have exposed or displayed those skill sets. Best of the recruiting partners pre-filter maybe like 80% of the candidates, right? So those candidates never reach out to me, right? So idea is that if you're sending, I don't want to spend a lot of time on bad candidates. I want to talk to like 5 people, and I want to probably extend an offer to 1 or 2, right? And then obviously like the standard offer to joining ratios take over. So best of the PM, best of the recruiting partners don't send me more than 5 CVs. And the recruiting partners on the other hand, so who send me like 30, right? So I absolutely hate working with those recruiting partners because I'm wasting my time and my team's time on filtering those folks. The companies who do really well on this pre-filtering, in fact, like are the big names, right? So Google and Facebook. I don't know how many people you have been exposed to, but the first round with the recruiting partner is actually a product round. So it's a pseudo product round, right? So where they're asking you about the questions, about the scenarios, right? wonderful, beautiful, because you're not really wasting the time of the team in filtering out candidates that anyways wouldn't have made to the final set, right? So idea is that please give us pre-filtered people on the skill sets that the hiring managers indicated are super important for that specific role. If you do these two things right, so you'll do a great job. So you'll because one, it gives you some structure while you're talking to your candidates, potential candidates, right? So it's not only about that blind understanding about what they have been up to, what they have been essentially like. So you can actually like give it some color. You can understand whether this person is a potential fit for the role that you're hiring for, and it is no reflection of that person, right? So it's just a question of fit, right? So that person might be a good fit for some other role, and that's fine, right? So that's absolutely fine. But you know that you're not going to waste your time by putting that person through the cycle for the role for which the fitment is not there. So understanding the skill sets and then spending time understanding the initial fitment, and almost, dare I say, almost acting as the first PM interviewer, right? So I think that's super important. The best of the recruiting partners over the years have done that. So that would be my input. Spend time on that.
Yep. So I think that's a fairly valid point what Vaneet is making here, because product manager is a very broad role, right? You cannot bucket it. Maybe I think UI dev backend, in a way, you can bucket it to some extent, right? But product manager is wide, very wide, because if you take only tech, non-tech is a different ballgame altogether, right? Like how Vaneet was mentioning about brand managers. Today there are brand managers in the FMCG world who are nothing but product managers, right? But in the tech world, we have this term called as product manager. But then again, this is highly diversified role. So unless and until we don't understand what exactly is the need of the hiring manager, which we may not get from the JD, right?
Let me be clear, right? I haven't seen a single JD that is clear about the skill sets, right? So everybody says that they've tried to do justice to JD, but I don't think that you can grab that information out of a JD. So you have to talk to the hiring manager on a one-on-one basis. You have to spend that time, right? And you have to, and I can obviously give you a structure in terms of the skill sets that you can ask for, but every hiring manager would have different skill sets in their mind. So please ask them, like, so for example, like one question you can ask them, what are the skill sets that will be judging this candidate on? So when they are going to put this candidate through that interview process, there would be some skill sets that they would be judging this candidate on. So what are those key skill sets? And please pre-filter the candidate basis those exact same skill sets. You do that, one, you improve your interview to selection ratio, right? So your HMs are gonna love you just because of that, right? Because you're saving their time. And most of the hiring managers are short pressed for time, so they don't have time. So this is something that they have to take out time, because this is a necessary evil, right? If you're able to save them time, they're gonna love you. And the only way for you to be able to do that is to do that pre-filtering. The only way for you to be able to do pre-filtering is to first understand the skill sets. So essentially, I think if there's one thing that you can take away is please spend time on this. Some HMs are not going to be happy about this. Please insist on this, right? So that is my biggest input. Or I would say, in my view, what has worked the best in last whatever, like a decade or so. The other input that I have for hiring managers, again, so to build upon that, please be persistent even after that pre-filtering, right? Because one thing I've seen between good recruiting partners versus bad recruiting partners, good recruiting partners are persistent in terms of ensuring a good candidate interview experience as well. Again, so some companies have it figured out, but a lot of startups don't, right? So which means that so you send out that CV, so you've done the pre-filtering, you send it over to your startup, hiring manager, or whatever, and then the interview doesn't happen for ages. Or the first round has happened, the second round doesn't happen, and the second round has happened, and third round gets rescheduled. Your job does not stop at sending out that CV. Your job is to ensure a good candidate experience as well, right? Because ultimately, a good candidate experience is going to determine whether I would say that candidate accepts the offer or not. So please be pretty persistent about following up, ensuring that I would say, first interview to closure time is not like many weeks. So it's under control. So candidate experience is super important. So those are two pieces that you have to be absolutely be, I would say, maniac about, right? So which is, uh, am I sending the right people? And once I've sent the right people to the hiring manager, am I closing? Am I ensuring that they get closed in a good enough time, in a short enough time, right? So, and closure might happen like any either way, right? So they might get rejected, they might get accepted, but it has to happen in a reasonable time of frame, reasonable time frame. Would not happen that often in a startup context if you do not track this very closely. Right? So it's very easy to fall in that trap that where you sent out CVs like probably a month back and interview processes haven't closed. So best PM or best recruiting partners would chase that as well. So those are two pieces that you have to chase.
Okay, so cool. So this helps. So I have one quick question. This question is, let's say, since PM role is highly diversified, right? Now there are some product managers who are like very rigid in terms of expectations, right? They are like, I need these four things together, right? And I need it, right? So now, how as a recruiter, how do I talk, or maybe how do I convince this person saying, "Hey, boss, all this four together, it's difficult to get it right," because some hiring and sometimes mostly in startup scenarios, you're ambiguous, you're not really clear what you want. You are like, okay, maybe 10 लोग को इंटरव्यू करते हैं उसमें से देखते हैं. Like that kind of a mindset is also there, right? Because in a startup, or maybe I'm trying to scale, I'm trying to grow, I've just got my recent funding, I'm not really clear in terms of my expectation of what kind of a person I really need, right? So then in that case, what would you suggest the hiring partner or a recruiter? How should we shape it up in that case?
Give me an example of those four things. Like, so again, just for me to understand the question better. So give me an example of that.
Okay, so let me give you an example. Let's say I need a PM who understands good amount of UX, right? Should work amazingly well work well with a UX guy. Should understand UX, right? Which UX works, how it works. Should have done UX analytics, right? After launching. Point number one. Point number two, should come with tech background. Should have been a developer for 2-3 years, right? And should have been good with go-to-market, right? And in terms of the feature, what feature works, which doesn't work, right? Now combination. And I am sure a lot of recruiters who are listening to this would have come across these kind of JDs if they work for PM, right? I'm sure a lot of them would say, yes, I have worked on these kind of roles. Now this is it's a rare cocktail, right? It's a rare unicorn. You don't get that, right? So now how do we go about?
Fair enough. No, so I think this is a pretty classical trap, right? So, and a lot of young HMs fall into that, which is they start looking out for unicorn, where they want somebody with good UX, good tech, and let me say good data abilities as well. And those three typically are different clusters. Somebody who's good at tech, rarely does it happen, and they're also good at UX. So, and that's where that step number one and step number two is very important. So either the HM is clear about the key skill sets or they're not. If they're not, so then the only way for you to be able to do justice to your role is to first understand the problem. So they probably will be clear about the problem they're trying to solve, right? So, or at least if they are clear about what part of the product would they be working on, for example, and then you can do a mapping of skill set on your own. So for example, so if they're going to be working on user-facing pieces, you know that UX is super important. You know that thought sense is super important. You know that customer centricity is super important. You know that ability to work with people is super important. These four are key skill sets. If they understand technology, well and good. So that's a good to have, right? So and then if they understand analytics, data, if they have data orientation, that's good to have. So these are the things that can be taught to a reasonable level. Vis-a-vis, so favorite example is tech platform. So you know that UX doesn't matter. It's typically an internal product. So whatever product you build, so UX does not matter, but tech jobs matter a lot. So then your job is to get the HM on the same page with respect to the focus skill sets and non-focus skill sets. So unless you do that, so you will continuously keep on seeing these rejections where you are hiring for the UX role, but that person gets rejected because he doesn't have tech jobs. So essentially, new for young HMs, the young hiring managers, for them to be able to understand that unicorns don't exist is super important. So now you have experience. So essentially, I'm assuming that as a recruiter, so you have seen these journeys in past, these life cycles in past. So it's your job to help them understand these skill sets and help them understand that the key skill, probably like differentiate between the focus skill sets for the role they're hiring for and non-focus skill sets. So unless you are able to have that conversation, so you'll not be able to solve that problem, right? So unfortunately, unicorn hunting is a difficult game, right? So you're not going to be successful in that, right? So unless you're able to, I would say, convert that game from being unicorn hunting to a much more manageable play. So I would say that Mantha is still same, right? So boss, you can't have 10 skills in one single person. So you can only have 2 to 3 to 4 skills. So please force your hiring manager to clearly define what are the key non-negotiable skills, and then go for that. If somebody says that I want somebody good at tech and somebody good at UX, that's a real combo. Like that's the reality. Like, so please have a conversation with them, right? So, and tell them that it's going to take a lot of time for them to be able to close that specific role, right? So those people do exist. It's not that they don't exist, but that's a really rare combo, right? So unless you set expectations right, so you'll not be able to do a good job of that.
Yeah, I believe Madhav, to bridge this gap, because this is a common problem which most of the recruiters face in their hiring problem. I believe to bridge this gap, what comes to my mind right away is create a heat map with the 10 skills and then say ki, if you're adding fourth or fifth more to it, you get a beep sound saying ki, was these are unicorns, and then get that heat map endorsed by people like you, right? So right, and then tell you, okay, there are 10, 20 chief product managers who have endorsed that if you go beyond this level, your expectation is like you're not getting it, right? You get a saying ki, like an error types, right? Like a 404, you get it saying ki, okay, there are people don't exist like this, because I think this would help the young hiring managers and budding hiring managers, because now I see a trend of training these budding hiring managers. I think this is catching up, which was not there earlier, because even I keep getting a lot of calls wherein to set the expectation with the hiring, because today there's a gap between hiring managers and recruiters. To fill this gap, it's not just about training the recruiters, right? It's also training the budding HMs. So that's when you can marry these two people both, because these two functions has to work together and go hand in hand. Unless and until you just train and upskill one end and the other end's expectation is too high and they're expecting unicorns, I think that becomes challenging, right? So yeah, so you made a fairly right point. I think in this particular approach, recruiters need to be more consultative in going it. Okay.
One other input that I have for these situations, and I have made all these mistakes, right? So during those days, right? So it's important for HMs to realize that there are some skills that can be taught, and there are skills that can't be taught, right? So for example, I believe that customer centricity is a hard skill to be taught. I believe that product sense, and this is my belief, so it could be different for different people. Product sense is a hard skill. Like, so either you have it or you don't have it. Customer empathy, either you have it or you don't have it. You can develop it over time, but it takes a long time for you to develop that. If you're in a UX role, so getting to that level of UX skill in a short enough time is going to take a lot of time. But data orientation typically can be taught. Tech skills, tech chops, typically, I would say, to a hygiene level can be taught. Now compare this. I think understanding this on both on the HM side as well as the recruiting partner side is important, right? So there would be candidates who would be great at UX. For example, so you have carved out 4 skill sets or 5 skill sets. You were able to have that conversation. So you were able to say that, okay, the heat map doesn't beep, to use your lingo, right? And even after that, what would happen is that you would have candidates who would be great at UX, would be great at product sense, would be great at managing the team, but the customer empathy would be weak. Because customer empathy typically can't be taught. But they're great at customer empathy as well, but the data orientation was weak. Now the question you need to ask yourself is that can you teach them data orientation, or can you teach them the way to think about problems with data in a shorter period of time or not? If you're able to do that, right, so then that's a good person to bet upon. So that's the bet, right? So what can be taught, what cannot be taught? First, understanding that by yourself as a recruiting person, and then having that conversation with the HR. So otherwise, I'll keep on saying this. This is an endless unicorn chase. So essentially, unicorn doesn't exist.
Okay, coming to the final set of questions, right? So one thing which I want to understand is, let's say, let's pick up an example from your hiring case, right? Let's say if you're currently maybe recently you've hired some PMs, right? Let's stick to maybe tech PMs or maybe tech plus little market facing, the product empathy, right? So this kind of a combination. Let's say if I'm a recruiter, right, and I have to hire someone for a role like that, which involves little tech and little products in the market facing and go to market. This is the combination. Now, what structure or maybe what framework kind of questions should I follow and ask the candidate, right? And try to understand whether he fits your need. Let's pick your example. Maybe you currently or maybe recently you've hired it with this particular context. What questions or probing you expect a recruiter to do, and then say, "Ki boss, this person is suitable beyond that of a resume," because resume does not have much, 1-2 pages. So can you just give us quickly a bunch of frameworks, right? These are the 2-3 questions I expect, and what is that I derive out of it? If a recruiter can give me this information from these 2-3 questions, and I derive more insights beyond that of a resume, can you just quickly run us?
So let's take a hypothetical scenario, right? So I'm hiring for a user-facing role. And if and you're the recruiter for me, so you're helping me with that particular position. So when you ask me that question in terms of skill sets, I'll probably call out 3 skill sets. I would say that so this person needs to be good at product, this person needs to be good at customer empathy, and this person ideally should be good at UX, but I can teach him UX. If he doesn't know UX, I can teach him UX, right? But product sense, user empathy, and ability to work with the team are non-negotiables, right? Now, what I expect from the recruiting person to do upfront is, so when they are having this first conversation with the candidate, so they will try and look at the product experience that this candidate has had from the lens of these 3 skill sets, right? So, for example, so some of the key questions, and this is like probably a mid-level hiring, then fresher hiring. We can talk about fresher hiring as well. But some of the key questions you can get into, right? So for example, like, so what are the key projects that you have done where you had to develop a product from understanding perspective, right? So, and then get deeper into that, right? So for example, like, so how you went about developing that product. So what were the customer needs? What were the things that, so what are the solutions that you translated those customer needs into, right? So how did you go about, what are the trade-offs that you made, right? So in a way, like, so there's no shortcut, right? So if you want to be good at product hiring, so you have to become good at initial product interviews as well. So understand how those filtering interviews happen, and then adapt some of those questions for your own pre-filtering. So you have to be, in fact, I would say that your job is slightly more difficult because the context for the candidate is not you interviewing them. So context for candidate is just sharing information with you as a recruiter, right? So, but you have to understand the skill set matching even during that conversation. But I would suggest is in terms of framework, again, so going back to the hypothetical scenario. So I wanted somebody to have good product sense. So I would ask them about the problems the product they worked on and how they went about building those products, right? So understand that. I wanted somebody to have good customer empathy. I would want to understand what are the key problems that they figured out, right? So if you may not be able to get much out of their previous experience, if you're not, and that's fine, right? So please ask them about general industry questions. For example, like one of my favorite questions these days is about food delivery, right? So which food delivery app do they use, and what do they think about those apps? What are the things that they're doing well? What are the things that they're not doing well? What are the key problems, user problems that can solve for these? Let's say somebody's favorite app is Swiggy, right? So what are the key problems that Swiggy can solve for its users? What are the key pain points that Swiggy is missing? So people, or WhatsApp for that matter, right? So everybody uses WhatsApp. So what are the key user pain points that WhatsApp is not solving for, right? So good product people, people who have good product sense, so would actually get into use cases. People with bad product sense would tell you that, okay, the button is smaller, the colors can be changed, or the number of people in the group should go beyond 200, right? Those are all incremental plays. They're not really thinking about problems. They're not really thinking about solutions, right? So those are some of the questions that you have to learn to bring into your initial conversations. If you're able to bring these questions into your initial conversations, you'll become much better at pre-filtering. Anyways, these questions are gonna get asked in the first and the second and the third rounds, right? So you should rather pre-filter at your end. So, and I think my mantra stays same. Understand the skill sets, uh, check for those skill sets during your pre-filtering rounds. Becomes much easier if the candidate has some experience. If the candidate does not have experience, so talk about these hypothetical scenarios in terms of what do you think about Swiggy, how do you improve Swiggy, how do you improve WhatsApp, what do you think, what are the key pain points that Swiggy is doing well on, what are the key pain points Swiggy is not doing well on. So if you're able to have those conversations, I think, and if the candidate is able to offer you some perspective, you will, I would say that that candidate is probably a good candidate. You will fail in the first conversation, the second conversation, the third conversation, the 10th conversation. By 10th conversation, so you would have a benchmark of what good candidates say, what bad candidates say. But it's important to go through that grind, right? So if you're not able to go through that grind, right? So don't worry about like the first 10 conversations because that's a learning experience for you. But start asking those questions, right? Please look at how Google manages this. Please look at how Facebook manages their product hiring. They do a phenomenal job. So recruiting partners do a phenomenal job. And like I said during the first half of this conversation, the first recruiting conversation is a pseudo product interview, right? So and those guys have walked these miles. So they from day one they were not doing this, right? So they've learned this the hard way, and they brought in some of these questions into those first conversations. So you have to do it the same way, and that's why they're phenomenal. And if you want to become as phenomenal as those guys are, so you have no choice but to become that pseudo product interviewer yourself. So I don't think there's any other choice.
Yep. So I think just to add to what Vaneet mentioned, so Vaneet, what he's trying to mention here is you need to master a particular role, right? So mastering in the sense you need not become a product manager, but you need to get the nitty-gritties. You need to go beyond the bunch of skills mentioned in the JD, right? And try to get more context. What Vaneet was trying to mention here in terms of the difference between an incremental feature and a case study, I'm sure a lot many recruiters may not get that, right? But the only way how do you reach there is something which I keep saying during my sessions is pick one particular role, have a target. Okay, I'm going to master this role in next 3 months, right? And have conversations with your hiring managers, with your candidates for that 3 months, right? And then what happens, you start getting more sense. Okay, this is what product manager is, right? These are the kind of questions I can ask. This is an incremental feature, this is a case study feature. That happens only if you can pick up one niche and focus towards that niche for maybe 3 months or 6 months. So that's the way out wherein you try to master one particular role. If you're someone, I'm not saying you shouldn't be hiring for Java or .NET, whatever, keep hiring, but pick up one role, try mastering that role for maybe 3 months or 6 months, whatever your grasping time is, and then later try moving to the next role. Then what happens, you become you that becomes a niche, and people like Vaneet who are specific hiring managers for the product manager role, they would love working with you, right? And it's all about people like Vaneet who are at the end of the day putting a good word to your TA heads and the HR heads, and that's where your hikes and all is like placed, right? If people like Vaneet, the hiring managers top of it, they feel like, okay, no, I'm getting 100 resumes to fill one position, then that doesn't work well. So you need to pick up a niche, and maybe in the interview also you can say, okay, product manager role is my niche, and other roles I can do it, but this is my niche. And I can ask these kind of questions, that makes a lot of difference. What do you say, Vaneet? Do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, no, so I completely agree, right? So two things, in fact, right? So first is actually a suggestion for the young recruiters. Please ask your HMs to shadow some of the interviews, some of the initial filtering interviews, so that you understand what kind of what kind of questions get asked in these filtering interviews. And second, how can you essentially, what are the good responses, what are the bad responses? And then co-opt some of those questions during your first conversations as well, right? And second, pride yourself on having a very, very high interview to selection ratio, right? So the best recruiting partners over the years would fight with me that they're only going to send me like 5 candidates, and one of them has to get converted. So they will not give me more than 5 CVs or 6 CVs. And those were the best recruiters ever, right? For the simple reason that they saved me my time. they essentially help me focus my time, right? So, and my team's time, right? So recruiting is a very, very, very expensive proposition if you really think about it, right? So because typical product manager goes through like 5 different rounds or 6 different rounds. There's like 6 hours of I would say productive time. PMs are typically always short of time, right? So which means that, and if you're interviewing like 20 people, right? So that's a lot of time to hire one person, right? So I would love, I'll continue insisting on that. The best recruiting guys will understand my role better than I do, will ensure that I only get like 3 to 4 to 5 CVs, will ensure that the candidate experience is spot on. So they do not let us slack. It's very easy for us to slack because we have a business to deliver. We are running an F1 car, right? And ultimately that F1 car has to continue running, right? So it's very easy for us to slack, but that recruiting partner keeps us honest and then ensures that the essentially that person once they joins in, the feedback loop is complete. Right? So somebody who's successful, so essentially they are able, so that they are able to take inputs from that somebody being successful and get us more people like that person. Somebody is not successful, so take out those people from the hiring pipeline. So essentially, like ensure that that feedback loop is completed. So I would say that those are 3 things that that you should focus on. You know, take your time for you to be able to develop those interviewing skills. The quickest fashion is to ask your HM for shadowing. Most HMs will be more than happy to help you shadow because ultimately this will help them optimize their time.
True, true, true. Yep. So amazing, Vaneet. So I think we've got some amazing pointers in terms of how to go about decoding the product manager role, and it's all about spending more time with our HMs and getting more context because this role is very wide, right? So it's a highly diversified role. Trying to understand and setting that expectation. I think you need to be very consultative in this role. If you're hiring for a PM, trying to understand the blueprint, what the hiring manager has in their mind when they want to hire a particular role, and that's when I think you'll be able to do justice. And same the HM's time, as Vaneet was mentioning, 6 hours of discussion for one guy. If it is like if you give 20 interviews, that's crazy time, 120 hours, and that time is equal to cost, and you're saving that much cost if you're able to do it, right? So thanks a lot, Vaneet, for tuning in and sharing your thoughts. And I think this has helped a lot of us get more insights and understand PM role and how do we go about decoding it. And thanks everyone for tuning in for this particular event. And I hope it was helpful. Thanks, Vaneet.
Sure. So thank you for having me here. So good conversation. Thank you. Good day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.